The morning began the way most mornings did on the Rourke Ranch, quiet, deliberate, almost sacred. The sun crept over the horizon with the slow dignity of a monarch, casting streaks of gold across the open prairie. Dew clung to the grass in glistening pearls, and the smell of fresh earth and hay mixed with the faint tang of cattle down by the south pasture. John Rourke stood on the wide wooden porch of the farmhouse, coffee mug warming his calloused hands. The house creaked softly around him, its timbers as old as the hills it stood on. He'd been up since 4:30, fed the horses, checked the water tanks, rode the fence line on his ATV. The rhythm of ranch life didn't forgive late sleepers. But as he sipped the dark, bitter coffee and listened to the low murmur of the waking land, something caught his attention. A truck. Dust plumed on the county road half a mile away, its rising tail glittering in the morning sun. That wasn't unusual. Delivery trucks, neighbors, even the mail carrier came through now and then. But there was something about this one. The truck slowed when it reached the entrance to his property, then came to a complete stop at the gate. John narrowed his eyes. It wasn't a feed truck, wasn't a neighbor's pickup. The vehicle was spotless, shiny white, with a small emblem on the door he couldn't quite make out from this distance. A figure stepped out, a woman, tall and thin, moving with a quick, clipped stride that was all business. John's gut tightened. He set his mug down on the porch railing and walked down the steps, boots crunching on the gravel. The gate was a good 200 yards from the house, so he whistled for Duke, his old cattle dog, who loped over and fell in at his heel. As John approached, he got a better look. The woman wore a crisp white blouse and navy slacks that looked better suited for a suburban boardroom than a ranch road. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, her sunglasses big enough to hide half her face, and in her hand was a clipboard, the universal herald of trouble. When she saw him coming, she plastered on a bright, rehearsed smile. "Morning," she called, voice pitched just a little too cheerfully. John stopped a few feet from the gate, one hand resting on the top rail. "Morning," he replied evenly. "You must be John Rourke," she said, already scribbling something on the clipboard. "That's me." "Perfect." She flipped a page on the clipboard and produced a crisp piece of paper, holding it out like she was presenting a trophy. "This is a formal notice of violation," she said in a tone that suggested she had given this speech many, many times. John didn't take the paper. "Violation of what, exactly?" She gave him a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You are in violation of several Whispering Oaks Homeowners Association regulations. Unapproved fencing material, livestock exceeding neighborhood limits, and," she paused dramatically to check the page, "operating an agricultural enterprise in a residential zone." For a moment John just stared at her, then let out a single, incredulous laugh. "Ma'am, this is a cattle ranch. Been a cattle ranch since before I was born. Hell, since before my daddy was born. You might want to check your maps." Her smile faltered, but only for a heartbeat. Then it returned, even tighter. "Mr. Rourke, whether you like it or not, your property falls under Whispering Oaks jurisdiction. The board has voted unanimously to bring you into compliance. You have 10 days to correct the infractions before we escalate to fines and, if necessary, eviction proceedings." John felt a muscle in his jaw tick. "Eviction? From my own land?" She shrugged one narrow shoulder. "Those are the rules. I don't make them, I just enforce them." John stepped closer, the space between them charged with a sudden tension. He stood a full head taller than her, his broad frame casting a long shadow across the road. "Listen," he said quietly but firmly, "this ranch has been here 100 years. There's no subdivision, no HOA, and no one, not you, not your board, is gonna tell me I can't run cattle on my own damn land." The woman's chin lifted, her tone sharpening. "My name is Karen Whitfield. I am the president of the Whispering Oaks Homeowners Association, and this isn't a debate. This is notice. 10 days, Mr. Rourke." She shoved the paper through the slats of the gate and let it flutter to the ground at his boots. Then, without waiting for a response, she turned on her heel and walked back to her truck. John bent and picked up the notice, crumpling it in his fist. "You just made a mistake," he muttered under his breath. Karen climbed into the truck, started it with a roar, and sped off, leaving a trail of dust in her wake. John stood there long after the sound of the engine had faded, the paper clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. The dog whined softly at his side. He'd dealt with stubborn neighbors, land disputes, even a county zoning board once, but this was different. This was someone coming onto his land, telling him he didn't belong. And that, John decided, was something he could not and would not let slide. When he finally turned back toward the house, there was a different look in his eyes. Not anger, not just anger, anyway. Something colder. Something sharper. Karen Whitfield had no idea who she had just declared war on. The notice sat on John Rourke's desk like a coiled rattlesnake. He'd flattened it out after crumpling it, just to read every single word, every smug, self-satisfied line that claimed to hold power over his land. The farmhouse office smelled faintly of leather and old wood, and the only light came from the brass desk lamp throwing warm gold over his maps and ledgers. John leaned back in the chair, running a hand down his jaw. On one wall hung his grandfather's old Winchester rifle, polished and silent, a reminder of the men who had fought to keep this ranch alive through droughts, blizzards, and bank repossessions. But this fight, this was different. He picked up the phone. By sunrise the next day, John's plan was already in motion. The National Homeowners Association Council headquarters was 1,500 miles away in D.C., but John didn't need to leave the ranch to exercise his authority. A single encrypted call to the council's legal division was all it took to set a compliance review in motion. Within 24 hours, the Whispering Oaks HOA received a certified letter. Mandatory charter audit, federal compliance required. It was the kind of letter that could make entire HOA boards resign overnight. 3 days later, John drove into town for the scheduled Whispering Oaks board meeting. His old F-250 rumbled into the community center parking lot, its tires crunching the perfectly maintained gravel that lined the subdivision streets. The contrast made him grit his teeth. Whispering Oaks looked like every copy-paste suburban paradise he'd ever seen, identical white fences, lawns trimmed to golf course perfection, mailboxes lined up like soldiers. The whole place smelled of fresh mulch and control. Inside the meeting hall, the air buzzed with chatter. John stepped through the double doors and the noise cut off like someone had pulled a plug. Every board member was there, a row of polo-shirted men and women sitting at a long folding table, each with their own neat stack of papers and branded Whispering Oaks coffee mug. At the center sat Karen Whitfield, looking like she'd stepped out of a real estate brochure, hair perfect, blouse ironed, smile just a little too smug. "Well," she said, folding her hands together. "Mr. Rourke. We weren't sure you'd come." John's boots echoed on the tile floor as he crossed the room, a thick leather binder under one arm. He didn't sit. He didn't even slow down. He set the binder down on the table with a heavy thunk that made a few board members flinch. "Oh, I wouldn't miss this," John said evenly. Karen arched an eyebrow. "Then perhaps you're ready to discuss the terms of your compliance." "No," John cut her off. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried, filling every corner of the room. "I'm here to discuss your violations." He flipped open the binder, pages of legal citations and federal compliance standards staring back at them. "You see," John continued, his tone calm but his words sharp as barbed wire, "your HOA charter expired 3 years ago. You never renewed it with the state. Which means every bylaw change, every fine, every action you've taken since then," he tapped the page with one calloused finger, "is null and void." Murmurs rippled through the room. One of the board members shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Karen tried to recover. "That's a paperwork error. We can fix that." "You can try," John said. "But it won't matter. Because your last board election? Never certified. Your financial records? Out of compliance with federal HOA audit standards. And those letters you sent threatening eviction?" He pulled out a single page, one of the notices. "These violate homeowner protection statutes. I could have your entire board removed before the end of the week." Karen's confident mask was cracking, just a little, but she still forced a laugh. "You expect us to believe you have that kind of authority?" John leaned forward, his gaze pinning her in place. "I don't expect you to believe it," he said softly. "I expect you to know it. Because I'm not just some rancher you can bully. I'm John Rourke, chairman of the National Homeowners Association Council. Every HOA charter in this country crosses my desk. Including yours. Silence. Even the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. One of the board members, a balding man with a weak voice, cleared his throat. What exactly are you saying? John straightened, his presence filling the room. I'm saying you have two choices. Dissolve your HOA voluntarily, return all improperly collected fines to the homeowners you extorted, and step down. Or, he let the word hang in the air. Or I refer this to federal investigators. You'll be looking at fines, asset seizures, and permanent disqualification from serving on any HOA board in the country. Karen's face had gone pale, but her pride wouldn't let her back down completely. You wouldn't dare. John slammed the binder shut, the sound like a gunshot. Try me. For a long, heavy moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, one of the board members raised her hand. I vote for dissolution, she said quietly. Another hand went up. Then another. Within 2 minutes, the entire board, every member except Karen, had voted unanimously to dissolve Whispering Oaks HOA. Karen sat there, frozen, her nails digging into the tabletop. It's over, John said, his voice final. By sunset tonight, Whispering Oaks HOA will no longer exist. And I strongly suggest you stay off my land. He turned, his boots thudding against the tile, and walked out without another word. By the time he drove back to the ranch, the sun was low on the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of crimson. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of cut hay and distant rain. John parked by the house and stood for a long moment, looking out over the pasture. One battle was over. But he knew Karen Whitfield, and people like her didn't quit easily. If she came back, she'd come back swinging. And next time, John intended to be ready. Rain slicked the courthouse steps that morning, turning the greystone a darker shade as the storm clouds churned overhead. It was the kind of weather that set the mood for war, and John Rourke knew this was the final battle. He stepped out of his truck, straightening the collar of his dark jacket. His boots echoed against the wet pavement as he walked up the steps. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with reporters, lawyers, and townsfolk curious about the trial that had become the talk of the county. Karen Whitfield had filed a lawsuit accusing John of abuse of power, claiming he had targeted her HOA unfairly and personally destroyed her reputation. The irony wasn't lost on him, she had tried to evict him from his own land, and now she was painting herself as the victim. John moved past the crowd, nodding once to the federal attorneys representing him. These weren't just local lawyers, they were heavy hitters from the National HOA Council's legal division, flown in specifically for this case. When the courtroom doors opened, the buzz of conversation fell into a tense hush. The courtroom smelled of old wood and polished brass. The judge sat elevated behind the bench, a stern figure with white hair and a gavel resting in front of him. The bailiff called for order, and everyone took their seats. Karen sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by two expensive-looking attorneys. She was dressed in a dark navy suit, her hair perfect, her expression cool and collected. But there was something brittle in her eyes, the look of someone who couldn't believe they had been challenged and was determined to win at any cost. John sat at the defense table, calm, unreadable. Plaintiff, you may begin, the judge said. Karen's lead attorney stood, buttoning his suit jacket. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen, this case is about unchecked power. My client, Karen Whitfield, was simply doing her duty as HOA president when she encountered Mr. Rourke. Instead of complying with the regulations like any responsible homeowner, he used his national position to retaliate, dissolve an entire neighborhood association, and humiliate my client publicly. He paced dramatically in front of the jury box. This is about fairness. This is about stopping one man from weaponizing his authority against ordinary citizens. Karen nodded along, her lips pressed in a thin line of righteous indignation. When it was the defense's turn, John's attorney rose. Your Honor, she began, the plaintiff would have you believe this is about fairness. But this is not a story of a citizen being abused, it is the story of an HOA president who operated outside the law, used intimidation tactics to force landowners into compliance with rules that never legally existed, and then retaliated when she was caught. She turned and gestured toward John. Mr. Rourke acted not as an angry rancher but as the duly appointed chairman of the National HOA Council, tasked with ensuring every association in the country follows the law. Whispering Oaks HOA did not. And the evidence we will present will prove that beyond a shadow of a doubt. The next 2 days were a war of words, paper, and witnesses. Karen's lawyers called board members who tried to testify that John had bullied them, but cross-examination revealed that most of them hadn't even read their own chartering years, and several admitted, under oath, that they had voted to issue fines to homeowners without proper hearings. Then came John's turn. His legal team produced documents showing that Whispering Oaks HOA had never renewed its charter, never filed proper elections, and had pocketed tens of thousands of dollars in fines without proper accounting. The coup de grace came when John's attorney produced emails obtained legally through discovery showing Karen had coordinated with a real estate developer to drive out ranchers and homeowners who lowered property values, clearing the way for new luxury housing projects. When those emails were read aloud in court, the jury shifted uncomfortably, and even the judge's expression hardened. Karen's face turned a deep crimson. On the final day, John himself was called to the stand. He walked to the witness box with the same steady stride he used when walking his fence line, calm under pressure. "Mr. Rourke," his attorney asked, "why did you intervene against Whispering Oaks HOA?" John looked at the jury, his voice steady. "Because someone had to. HOAs were meant to keep communities safe and well kept, not to terrorize people, not to force families off their land because they didn't fit someone's idea of perfect. I didn't dissolve Whispering Oaks out of spite. I did it because they broke the law, and they thought no one would hold them accountable." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I've spent my life protecting this ranch. But I'm also responsible for protecting millions of other homeowners across this country. If I let this slide, if I let people like Karen Whitfield keep abusing their power, then what good is my position? What good are the rules if no one enforces them?" The courtroom was silent. Even Karen, for once, had nothing to say. When the jury returned after only 2 hours of deliberation, the verdict was unanimous. In favor of John Rourke. The judge's ruling was swift and devastating for Karen. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said sternly, "the evidence shows a pattern of illegal conduct, fraudulent elections, and malicious targeting of property owners. Not only is your lawsuit dismissed with prejudice, but you and your board are hereby barred from serving on any HOA board for life. Additionally, you are ordered to repay all improperly collected fines to the homeowners of Whispering Oaks within 90 days. Karen's composure shattered. "This isn't fair," she cried, standing abruptly. "He destroyed everything." "Enough," the judge snapped, slamming the gavel. "You destroyed it yourself." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the steps. Cameras flashed as John emerged, his hat pulled low against the drizzle. "Mr. Rourke," one journalist shouted. "What does this mean for HOAs nationwide?" John stopped at the top of the steps and looked out over the crowd. The rain streaked down his jacket, but his voice was clear and steady. "It means the days of abusive HOAs are over," he said. "No one should live in fear of a board with unchecked power. If you're running your HOA the right way, you have nothing to worry about. But if you're running it like a fiefdom, consider this your warning." The reporters erupted with questions, but John simply tipped his hat and walked down the steps, disappearing into the rain. That evening, back at the ranch, the sky was clear again. The sunset spread in a blaze of orange and purple across the horizon, lighting up the wide pastures. John stood on the porch, coffee mug in hand, the same spot where this war had started. Duke lay at his feet, tail thumping lazily against the boards. The land stretched out before him, quiet, free, and his, as it had always been. Somewhere out there, Karen Whitfield was licking her wounds. But she wouldn't be back. And if anyone else thought about trying the same thing, they'd remember the man who took down an entire HOA with nothing but the rulebook and won. John allowed himself the smallest of smiles. War was over. The ranch was safe. And the message was clear. Don't pick a fight with the man who writes the rules.